In the dim hours before dawn, when the Channel winds clawed at the tent flaps and scattered charts trembled beneath the weight of cold lamps, Lord Louis Mountbatten sat alone with the brittle silence that only comes when a decision has already been taken by someone far away, and the consequences have not yet reached the men who will bleed for it. The Allied High Command had shifted the D-Day timetable overnight. A small gesture on paper, a devastating storm in practice, and as he traced the new sequence of arrows and tides, he felt the immense and crushing solitude of command tighten around his ribs. He understood with the clarity of a man who has studied war not as a field of maneuvers, but as the slow erosion of youth and hope, that the slightest alteration in the choreography of invasion would ripple through every unit preparing to cross that dark strip of sea. It was not merely hours changing, it was the fragile balance between moonlight and shadow, between the rising and falling tide that might conceal or expose the men rushing toward the shore, between the hope of surprise and the certainty of slaughter. Even the air seemed to thicken with consequence. Mountbatten lifted his gaze toward the map as if it were a living thing that demanded negotiation. He sensed the future unfolding like a storm-tossed tapestry, each thread a decision that would bind itself to the souls of soldiers, clenching their rifles with hands they hoped would not tremble on the beaches of Normandy. He felt the weight of the new timetable sink into his bones, for it meant recalculating landing craft intervals, reassigning destroyer escorts, adjusting the fragile fabric of secrecy that shielded the Enterprise from German eyes that lingered hungrily across the water. Every minute lost or gained was a heartbeat removed from or added to the lives of men who trusted their commanders far more than they trusted fate. He thought of them as he rarely allowed himself to, not as divisions or brigades, but as farm boys who once felt summer wheat brushing their knees, as factory workers who kissed their mothers goodbye with promises they hoped would not turn to dust, as young husbands writing letters they feared might be discovered among their bloodied uniforms. Beyond the walls of his temporary headquarters, the night murmured with the restlessness of troops roused by rumour. The low hum of engines, the clatter of boots on gravel, the muffled conversations drifting in and out of the shadows, all carried a tremor of anticipation Mountbatten could feel, as surely as if the earth itself were shifting beneath him. He stepped outside, letting the cold air strike his face with the authority of truth, and he watched the silhouettes of sentries navigating their patient arcs. They seemed like figures sculpted from the darkness, each one tethered to a destiny being rewritten without their knowledge. He inhaled the sharp scent of damp canvas, gun oil, and sea salt, imagining how this sudden alteration in timing would stretch into logistical knots that engineers and officers were even now trying to untangle before the sun revealed their exhaustion. He walked along the rows of tents, listening as whispers turned to questions, and questions turned to speculation, though no one dared approach him directly. He sensed the moral obligation to meet their uncertainty with composure, and so he straightened his posture and let his steps fall with a rhythm that conveyed assurance even as uncertainty gnawed at his inner composure. For Mountbatten understood that leadership in war was an act of performance as much as strategy, a theatre in which the commander must appear unbreakable, so that those who fight under his command believe they can endure the impossible. Inside his chest, however, the turmoil spun like a compass maddened by iron, because he knew that the success of this invasion depended not only on ships and charts, but on the fragile alignment of weather, secrecy, courage, and the unyielding passage of time. When he returned to the planning tent, the lamplight seemed harsher, the shadows longer, and the weight of the new timeline heavier than when he had first examined it. He placed both hands on the table, feeling the rough grain of the wood ground him as he accepted the cold truth that adaptation was no longer a choice, but a necessity. He began marking new orders, issuing fresh directives, coordinating with his staff through a steady voice that betrayed nothing of the unease churning beneath the surface. The night deepened into a steely pre-dawn blue as he worked, shaping the revised invasion plan with the meticulous calm of a surgeon, aware that any imprecision would cost lives. Yet even in that grim calculus, there was a strange tenderness, a quiet vow that he would bend the tides of circumstance as far as human will allowed to give those young men their best chance of touching the sands of Normandy and rising again. As the horizon paled with the first faint promise of morning, Mountbatten paused and allowed himself one final moment of reflection. He felt the world preparing to shift, as if the very ocean were holding its breath. The decision had been made elsewhere, but the responsibility of its execution now rested on his shoulders, and he accepted it with the tired dignity of a man who no longer believed in glory, but still believed in duty. And as he stepped outside to face the awakening camp, the sky bleeding slowly into light, he understood that history would never record the quiet agony of this night, yet it would echo silently in every footstep that soon marched toward France. If you're reading this, tell me in the comments where you're watching from before we continue the story. The morning unfolded like a slow, reluctant confession. Pale sunlight leaked across the channel, and the world seemed suspended between expectation and dread. Mountbatten stood before the new operational table, his eyes tracing the red markings that now dictated the fates of thousands. Around him, aides whispered updates about tides, winds, and ship readiness. The change in the D-Day timetable had forced a labyrinthine reorganization, each adjustment echoing outward into 1,000 smaller disruptions. It was as if a single stone had been cast into a still lake, and now the ripples reached even the furthest corners of Allied preparation. Yet beneath the visible machinery of war, the ticking of watches, the shuffling of papers, the clipped tones of officers, there was another current, deeper and unspoken, the question of whether human ingenuity could truly master chaos. Mountbatten's thoughts drifted to the night before, to the letters he had read from his staff officers' desks. Letters addressed to wives, lovers, parents. Some were confident, almost cheerful, others heavy with premonition. He wondered whether those words would ever find their way across the sea, or whether they would remain sealed in the pockets of uniforms torn apart by shrapnel. That thought, though unbearable, was the constant companion of any commander. War made poets of the doomed, and the living became custodians of their final verses. For a moment, he closed his eyes and listened, not to the chatter of telephones or the mechanical hum of preparations, but to the distant muffled pulse of engines assembling offshore. There, beyond the horizon, ships waited like giant breathing beasts tethered to invisible chains of secrecy. He was interrupted by the arrival of Admiral Ramsay, his face drawn but composed. The two men exchanged a silent nod, a gesture that contained volumes. Ramsay spread new tide charts across the table, their edges frayed from constant handling. The altered timing meant the landing crafts would now meet a more volatile current. Mountbatten studied the numbers, calculating without words. Every variable seemed to conspire against them. Weather, visibility, even the capricious moods of the sea. Yet as he scanned the figures, he also felt a stubborn pulse of defiance. For all its indifference, nature could still be outwitted by human will. "We move with the tide," he said finally, his voice low, "or we do not move at all." Ramsay gave a brief nod, as if affirming not just the decision, but the courage to make it. Outside, officers hurried to relay updated orders. The tempo of the camp quickened, a fragile symphony of coordination and urgency. Mountbatten watched as messages were typed, encoded, transmitted through trembling wires that carried the weight of history itself. He saw the young signals officer, barely 20, tapping out orders to entire divisions, his hands steady, though his lips whispered silent prayers. There was something both beautiful and tragic in the precision of it all, the perfect synchronization of men preparing for an event that would almost certainly shatter that perfection within the first hour of combat. By noon, the air was vibrating with anticipation. Planes roared overhead in test formations, their shadows slicing across the camp like omens. Mountbatten walked toward the cliffs overlooking the sea, where from a high vantage point he could see the flotilla gathering like a metallic horizon. Hundreds of ships, each one bristling with purpose, moved in slow, deliberate patterns. The sight was magnificent, almost serene, but to him it felt like standing on the edge of a precipice and looking down at a rising tide of destiny. He could not help but think of the Germans waiting across that narrow stretch of water. Men his age, trained, frightened, and equally bound by duty. The thought brought him no comfort, only the grim understanding that war devoured symmetry. Each side believed it was defending civilization, and yet civilization always bled the most. When he returned to headquarters, a fresh dispatch awaited him from Eisenhower's staff. The tone was pragmatic, but Mountbatten could read the anxiety between the lines. The new schedule left little room for error. Delays in one sector could unravel the entire invasion. He folded the message carefully, almost reverently, and tucked it into his jacket. His face betrayed nothing as he resumed issuing orders, but within him, a silent monologue unfolded, a private reckoning with the fragility of plans, the cruelty of chance, and the paradox of leadership that required both empathy and the capacity to send men knowingly into hell. It was a burden too large for the human heart, yet he bore it as all great commanders did, quietly, steadily, without complaint. That night, as darkness reclaimed the camp, Mountbatten lingered by a single flickering lamp. He wrote in his journal, not as a record for history, but as a way to preserve the last fragments of clarity before chaos took hold. He wrote of tides and courage, of error and grace, of how the smallest alteration in time could alter the course of nations. When he finished, he closed the book and sat back, listening to the waves clawing at the shore. Somewhere beyond that darkness lay Normandy, the promise and the price of liberation intertwined. He whispered a quiet vow to himself, a promise not to any general or king, but to the ordinary men who would soon wade through surf and fire. And with that, he extinguished the lamp. If you've been following the story so far, take a moment to subscribe. It helps bring more of these powerful World War II stories to life. The night before the invasion was unlike any other in Mountbatten's memory. Vast, still, and unbearably fragile. The camp had grown quieter, though the silence was dense with unseen movement. Radios whispered behind canvas walls. Clerks filed the last coded orders, and officers moved like shadows between flickering lamps. The new timetable had been transmitted, verified, and locked into place. There would be no further changes. The machinery of fate was now engaged, and Mountbatten could feel its slow, inexorable turning, as if some immense wheel of history had begun to move and no mortal hand could stop it. He knew that by this time tomorrow, the beaches of France would be burning, the sea running thick with oil and blood, and the names of towns that had slept through centuries would be carved forever into memory. Omaha, Juneau, Gold, Sword, Utah. Mountbatten stood at the edge of his command post, looking toward the sea that shimmered faintly under a moon cloaked in thin cloud. The horizon was alive with silhouettes, the dark bulk of ships gathering, the restless swell of landing craft nudging against their moorings. The low rumble of engines kept warm through the night. Every light that flickered across the water felt to him like a heartbeat. Behind those lights, men waited, some praying, some pretending to sleep, some simply staring at the same horizon, wondering if they would see it again. He had seen armies gather before, but never one so vast, so synchronized, so heavy with purpose. It was no longer a question of military superiority. It was a collision of faith and exhaustion, of human endurance stretched to its farthest edge. He returned to his quarters only briefly, unable to rest. On his desk lay a series of reports. Last-minute weather forecasts, naval readiness updates, coded intercepts from German radio traffic. The meteorologists were still uncertain. A thin window of fair weather had opened unexpectedly, but it might close again without warning. Eisenhower's decision to proceed was as courageous as it was irreversible. Mountbatten understood the cost of hesitation, but he also knew the tyranny of time. Every hour delayed meant an increased risk of discovery, of the enemy tightening its defenses. The D-Day timetable was no longer just an order of operations. It was a lifeline stretched between desperation and resolve. He picked up a small framed photograph that had followed him through every posting. His wife, Edwina, her eyes serene even in black and white. He wondered what she would think if she saw him now. His face drawn by sleeplessness, and his heart bruised by the knowledge of what was to come. He spoke to her in silence, the way soldiers often speak to ghosts, asking for nothing but the strength to endure what duty demanded. When he set the frame back on the table, he felt the faintest tremor in his hand, as though the human part of him, the one he kept buried beneath layers of discipline and decorum, had surfaced briefly, reminding him that even admirals are not immune to fear. By the early hours, the first waves began to move. The low thrum of engines grew into a living pulse that rolled across the channel like a heartbeat magnified by the sea. Mountbatten stood on a cliff overlooking the water, the wind clawing at his coat as he watched the great armada assemble. Ships stretched to the horizon, destroyers, transports, gunboats, each a fragment of a single immense organism. It was the sound of civilization reclaiming its right to exist. He could see signal lamps flashing between vessels, the choreography of light that replaced words in this vast theatre of silence. For all the noise and motion, what struck him most was the stillness within himself. He was witnessing not simply a battle, but a transformation, the moment when hope ceased to be a dream and became an act of defiance. An officer approached, breath visible in the cold air, his voice trembling with urgency. Reports had arrived of confusion among a few embarkation units, a consequence of the sudden timetable change. A handful of landing craft had missed their assigned positions, and communications were strained. Mountbatten listened without interruption, his mind parsing each detail with the precision of a surgeon. When the officer finished, Mountbatten's response was calm, almost gentle. "Realign them," he said. "Use their delay. Let the enemy think it's deception." It was a simple command, but beneath it lay the unspoken creed of every great strategist, that even error could be reshaped into advantage if one had the courage not to panic. As the first light bled through the clouds, Mountbatten descended toward the shore, where some of the smaller craft were departing. The men looked up as he passed, faces pale in the half-light, eyes wide but steady. He spoke no words of encouragement. There was nothing left to say. Every man already carried within him all the courage he would ever need. He simply touched his cap, and they saluted in silence, the gesture passing between them like a sacred vow. The wind carried the sound of distant thunder. Or perhaps it was artillery, already echoing faintly from across the sea. By mid-morning, the sky was streaked with contrails. The invasion was in motion. Mountbatten stood watching the horizon vanish beneath clouds of smoke. The air smelled of salt and fuel and the coming storm. He thought again of the timetable, that fragile, mutable line of ink that had rewritten the rhythm of history. It had forced them to improvise, to suffer, to adapt, but it had also revealed something extraordinary, the capacity of human beings to bend beneath chaos without breaking. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer not for victory, but for mercy. Mercy for those who fought, for those who commanded, for those who would soon bury the fallen. He knew that when the world looked back on this day, it would see maps, strategies, and triumphs. But he also knew that beneath those triumphs lay this single truth, that history is not made by plans, but by the hearts that survive their failure. The dawn of June 6th arrived not as sunrise, but as revelation. A pale, trembling light breaking through the armour of the sea, unveiling a horizon choked with motion. From his vantage point atop the operations deck, Mountbatten could see the vast armada spreading outward like an unfolding scripture, each ship a syllable in the language of deliverance. The channel was alive, foaming with the movement of men and metal, the low growl of engines merging with the eternal rhythm of the waves. It was not merely a battle forming, it was civilization exhaling after years of suffocation. Yet for all the magnitude of it, there was an unbearable intimacy to the moment. Every explosion he would soon witness, every landing craft torn apart by fire, every flare and scream carried across the water would be traced, in some way, back to the lines he had redrawn on that map when the timetable changed overnight. Reports came flooding through in fractured bursts, coded messages, radio fragments, voices drowned in static. Some beaches were chaos, others unfolding with eerie precision. At Omaha, the sea itself had turned against them, waves swallowing craft, smoke obscuring landmarks, German guns shredding the first assault. Mountbatten gripped the edge of the table as dispatch after dispatch crackled through the comms. His aides recorded every message, their pens trembling as if writing scripture in the language of catastrophe. He gave orders with a calm that seemed detached, almost holy, though inside he was unraveling thread by thread. For no commander, however seasoned, could ever truly reconcile the arithmetic of war, the transformation of numbers and positions into flesh and blood and silence. By midday, the skies over Normandy were a tapestry of fire. Allied bombers thundered overhead, strafing the coastal defences, while paratroopers, scattered by wind and confusion, descended like ash across the French countryside. Mountbatten listened to the reports of entire platoons lost to the tides, of others fighting their way through hedgerows, of commanders improvising heroism out of chaos. It was the very embodiment of war's paradox, the meticulousness of planning collapsing into the raw, instinctive violence of survival. And yet, amid the carnage, patterns began to emerge. Pockets of success, beachheads forming, men clawing their way inland inch by inch. The tide of history, once uncertain, had begun to turn. He walked to the viewing deck where the wind tore at his uniform and the scent of salt and smoke stung his eyes. Through binoculars, he could see the distant smudge of Normandy's coast, the faint outlines of cliffs, the dark stain of burning ships. The sea between here and there was littered with the wreckage of courage, twisted steel, drifting bodies, lifeboats overturned, flags half submerged. It was both victory and tragedy unfolding in the same breath. And Mountbatten felt, for the first time in his long career, the full moral weight of command. This was not glory. It was sacrifice turned into necessity, necessity disguised as duty. An aide approached, face pale beneath the harsh light. "Sir, the German coastal guns are weakening. Our destroyers are closing range." Mountbatten nodded, though his eyes remained fixed on the horizon. He thought of the young captains steering their vessels into hell, their hearts pounding in rhythm with the sea. The difference of a few hours, the very shift in the timetable, had brought them to this moment of converging tides and exposed fortifications. The delay that had seemed an inconvenience now appeared almost providential. He wondered whether history's great events were not shaped by genius or chance, but by the subtle collisions of human error and divine irony. The afternoon dragged on, each hour steeped in noise and loss. Messages of casualties arrived like falling stones. Entire companies had been erased before setting foot on dry land. Yet for every report of destruction, another followed. A breakthrough, a stronghold taken, a flag raised. The chaos was absolute, but within it, something steady pulsed. The invasion, against all odds, was holding. Mountbatten felt neither triumph nor relief, only a profound stillness, the kind that comes when a man realizes he has crossed a line beyond which nothing will ever be the same again. He turned from the sea and entered the operations tent, where his officers worked under the relentless glow of lamps. The air was thick with smoke and exhaustion. One of them looked up, eyes hollow but burning with belief. "Sir," he said softly, "they're pushing through. We've got men inland." Mountbatten gave a slow nod, his throat too dry to answer. It was happening, not as planned, not as imagined, but as lived reality, grim and glorious. The invasion that had nearly unraveled under the weight of shifting hours and tides was now reshaping Europe. When dusk finally came, the channel burned with reflected fire. Columns of smoke reached toward the heavens like black prayers. Mountbatten stood once more by the shore, alone this time, watching the horizon fade into a bruised violet. Somewhere out there, men were dying for an idea, for the fragile, luminous notion that tyranny could be undone. He knew that victory would soon be claimed, speeches written, medals forged. But what haunted him was the memory of this day not as triumph, but as testimony. that every success in war is built upon a mountain of quiet suffering. As he turned back toward camp, he carried that truth with him like a wound that would never close. He had obeyed orders, executed plans, adjusted to changes, and fulfilled his role. Yet in the solitude of his soul, he understood that history would never record the sleepless eyes, the trembling hands, the men who never knew why the hour of their death had shifted because someone, somewhere, had redrawn the timetable overnight. The invasion had succeeded. The beaches were taken, the lines held, and the tide of war had begun to roll inland, swallowing fields and hedgerows once untouched by battle. But in the hours and days that followed, as the thunder of guns faded into a sullen distance, Mountbatten discovered that victory bore a soundless aftermath, a quiet heavier than any bombardment. The Channel, once roaring with ships, now lay scattered with their remains, a metallic graveyard gleaming under the grey light of dawn. Smoke drifted like wounded ghosts across the horizon, and every wave that touched the shore seemed to whisper the names of men who would never return. He walked alone along the docks where supply vessels now unloaded their endless cargo of ammunition, fuel, and rations. The same tide that had carried the living to war was now returning with the dead. Stretchers moved in solemn procession. Some bore only helmets, others shrouded forms too still to be mistaken for sleep. Mountbatten paused before them, his expression unreadable. The Admiral's uniform carried its usual authority, but beneath it, his heart felt threadbare. Every life here, he thought, was a sentence rewritten by that sudden change in the timetable, the one made in the sterile calm of a map room, far removed from the chaos it would unleash. He could not help wondering how many of these faces might have lived had the hour been left untouched, had the tide met them differently, had the gods of war turned their heads just once. Later that afternoon, Mountbatten gathered with his senior staff inside the operations tent. Maps now showed not plans, but achievements. Sectors coloured in to mark progress. Red arrows curling inland like veins of victory. The officers spoke in measured tones about consolidation, logistics, reinforcement schedules. To an outsider, it would have sounded like triumph, the calculated aftermath of success. But Mountbatten could see the weariness behind every voice. These men had stared too long at the edge between numbers and humanity. He watched them with quiet admiration, for they bore the same invisible wound he did. The knowledge that leadership in war required both vision and a willingness to bear guilt that would never fade. When the meeting ended, he remained behind. The tent emptied, leaving only the rustle of paper and the distant murmur of waves. He sat alone before the map, tracing the black lines that represented movement, the dots that represented lives. It struck him suddenly how fragile the whole design was, how an empire of planning could be undone by a single gust of wind, a single wrong turn, a single order misheard through static. And yet, somehow, through the madness, they had prevailed. He leaned back and closed his eyes, letting the silence fill him. For the first time in weeks, exhaustion overtook duty. His mind drifted, not toward celebration, but toward memory. He saw in his thoughts the faces of men boarding the landing craft that morning, faces caught between fear and faith. He saw the hands gripping the edges of boats, the small gestures of courage no camera would ever capture. And he saw, too, the faces of those who would not come back. It was a private gallery of ghosts, painted not in glory, but in truth. Mountbatten had always believed that victory required sacrifice, but he had never understood until now that sacrifice did not end with death. It continued in the hearts of those who ordered it. Night fell again, and with it came the storm. The wind howled across the coast, scattering ash and rain in equal measure. Mountbatten stood by the shoreline, coat drawn tight, staring into the dark sea. Somewhere out there, the remnants of the first assault still drifted, silent testimonies to the cost of liberation. He thought of the messages sent that morning, of the coded phrase that had triggered an army to move. It had been a single order, a simple sequence of words. Yet it had carried within it the sum of everything humanity could be: disciplined, courageous, flawed, and achingly mortal. He turned to the officer standing nearby, a young man with eyes far older than his years. "They did it," Mountbatten said softly, his voice nearly lost to the wind. "Yes, sir," the officer replied, though neither spoke of victory. They both understood that this was something larger, something beyond celebration. Mountbatten looked back toward the dark horizon. "History," he murmured, "is written in the silence after the noise." The officer did not answer, but he nodded, and in that gesture lay a kind of reverence, as though they were standing at the edge of something sacred. That night, Mountbatten returned to his quarters. On his desk lay a telegram from London, brief, official, full of congratulations. He read it once, then folded it neatly and placed it aside. Instead, he opened his journal. The lamp burned low as he wrote, "We have won the first battle, but not the last. I cannot celebrate. Every decision I made is now written on the sea." His pen paused. He added one final line before closing the book. "The timetable was changed overnight, but time itself remains beyond command." Outside, the waves continued their endless dialogue with the shore, a rhythm older than war, older than man. Mountbatten listened to it until sleep finally came, deep and uneasy. Deep. The world would remember the day as a victory, but he would always remember it as a lesson, that even triumph carries the scent of mourning, and that the hand that directs history must also bear its scars. The journey back to England was neither triumphant nor peaceful. The sea that had borne the weight of the invasion now carried the silence of its aftermath. Mountbatten stood at the deck's edge, coat flapping against the wind, eyes fixed on the bruised horizon. The waves were restless, as though unwilling to accept what had transpired. Each crest and fall seemed to whisper the names of ships lost, of men swallowed whole by the cold embrace of the channel. Around him, the officers spoke softly, their voices stripped of ceremony. There were no cheers, no songs, only the low hum of engines pushing them homeward through a fog thick with memory. Victory had been achieved, but it was not the kind that lifted hearts. It was the kind that left a residue, invisible, corrosive, eternal. When they reached Portsmouth, the docks were alive with celebration. Flags unfurled, bands played, and journalists pressed forward like waves against the tide. Mountbatten's face appeared in the flashes of cameras, a hero's mask polished for history. But beneath it, his expression remained distant, almost mournful. Reporters shouted questions about strategy, about timing, about the brilliance of coordination that had made D-Day possible. He answered with measured precision, his tone formal, detached, his words carefully chosen to honor the living without betraying the dead. The crowd saw composure. He felt fracture. Each cheer seemed to strike a hollow note inside him, like applause at a funeral. That evening, in London, he attended a private meeting with Churchill and Eisenhower. The room was filled with the smoke of cigars and the exhaustion of victory. Maps covered the walls, marked with fresh lines of conquest. The conversation flowed between logistics and politics, the liberation of France, the next steps toward Germany, the reorganization of command. Mountbatten spoke when required, offering his observations in the clipped cadence of military restraint. But his thoughts wandered. He kept seeing the faces on the stretchers, the letters never sent, the sea reclaiming its dead. Every victory discussed around that polished table had been purchased with the currency of youth. And as the others spoke of triumph, Mountbatten heard only the echo of waves breaking against steel. After the meeting, he walked alone through the streets of London. The city was alive again, lights restored, laughter seeping through pub windows, music rising faintly from radios in open doorways. It should have felt like resurrection, but to him, it felt like dissonance. He paused before a shop window displaying newspapers whose headlines declared the dawn of liberation. His name appeared beneath the photographs of beaches and soldiers. Admiral Mountbatten, architect of victory. He stared at the words, unmoving. How strange, he thought, that history could sculpt sanctity out of suffering. He turned away, the reflection of his own face vanishing into the glass. In the days that followed, commendations arrived. Medals, citations, invitations to speak. Mountbatten accepted them with grace, for refusal would have dishonored those who had fought. Yet each ceremony felt like a performance, each speech a ritual of concealment. Behind the applause, he felt the presence of unseen eyes, the ones who would never attend, never hear, never return. He began to write again in his journal, not reports, but confessions. "They call it victory," he wrote one night. "But what I saw on those beaches was something older than victory, the raw endurance of men who refused to die without purpose." He wrote of the noise, the smoke, the trembling sea, and the fleeting beauty of courage glimpsed between explosions. He wrote until the words blurred, until the ink itself seemed to weep. Weeks passed. The war pressed onward across Europe, but for Mountbatten, time lost its forward motion. He visited hospitals, where wounded soldiers lay in rows beneath white sheets. Some greeted him with shy smiles, others turned their faces away. He shook hands, spoke of pride and gratitude, but what he truly offered was silence, the only language that felt honest. In their eyes he saw what no medal could redeem, the look of men who had glimpsed eternity and returned only half alive. At night, when London slept beneath blackout curtains now rolled away, Mountbatten would sit by the window of his quarters, the city lights trembling on the Thames. He thought often of the night when the timetable changed, the moment that had shifted everything. He no longer asked whether it had been right or wrong. War had no such answers. There was only the question of whether one had endured it with dignity. He lifted his glass, not in toast, but in remembrance, and whispered into the darkness, "We moved with the tide, and the tide kept moving." The river shimmered faintly, carrying his reflection toward the sea. Years passed, and the war that had once consumed the world began to retreat into memory. Europe rebuilt itself from rubble, cities rose again from ashes, and the seas that had once run red grew calm, indifferent, endless. Lord Louis Mountbatten, now older, greyer, and touched by that peculiar stillness that comes only after having seen too much, often returned to the coast to walk alone. The wind still smelled of salt and iron. Gulls still circled above the cliffs as though nothing had changed. Yet he knew that beneath those waves lay the bones of an army and the echo of a single decision that had altered the rhythm of history. He walked with his hands clasped behind his back, the horizon a pale line of eternity before him. The world now called him a hero, but the title sat uneasily upon his shoulders. He had learned that history simplifies what it cannot bear to remember. The books spoke of victory, of precision, of genius, but none spoke of the tremor in his hands as he signed the orders that changed the D-Day timetable overnight. None recorded the hollow eyes of the wounded, the letters that arrived too late, the empty beds that became the true measure of triumph. He carried all of it still, not as guilt, but as memory, a sacred, unending duty to remember what others preferred to forget. In his later years, Mountbatten was often invited to speak at commemorations. He stood before crowds of veterans and families, before the graves marked with white crosses that stretched like an endless choir of silence. The speeches were always the same, words about courage, sacrifice, liberation, but his voice, though steady, carried a gravity that silenced applause. When he looked out over those fields of marble, he saw not glory, but continuity, the quiet, stubborn persistence of life that endures after the noise of war fades. "The sea remembers," he would sometimes say, and in those words was an entire philosophy, that nothing done by human hands ever truly disappears. It merely changes shape, carried forward by tide and time. In private, he wrote less and less, until his journal became a book of single lines. June 6th again, the wind the same, the sky indifferent. Another page. They call it peace, but it feels like waiting. His handwriting grew smaller, slower, as though the words themselves were reluctant to leave him. And yet, in that quiet decline, there was a kind of peace, not the peace of forgetting, but the peace of understanding. He had learned that history is not the story of generals or battles, but of moments, fragile, invisible, often lost, when men choose conscience over fear or duty over rest. He had made his choice long ago, and it had shaped everything. On the final anniversary he attended, Mountbatten stood before the sea one last time. The veterans were fewer now, their uniforms hanging loose on frail frames, their medals heavy with meaning. The sky was clear, the waves calm. As the ceremony ended, Mountbatten remained by the shore, alone. The tide touched his boots, cool and familiar. He closed his eyes and let the wind press against his face. In the whisper of the surf, he could almost hear them, the voices of those who had crossed before him, calling not for glory, but for remembrance. He smiled faintly, not in pride but in gratitude, for he had lived long enough to understand that no victory was ever clean and no loss ever complete. The sea shimmered, the gulls wheeled, and the horizon stretched without end. Somewhere in that distance, time folded upon itself, and for a single heartbeat, the admiral, the sea, and the memory of D-Day became one. And when the tide withdrew, it left only footprints in the sand, soon erased, but never forgotten. If this story moved you, remember to like and subscribe. It helps keep the memory of those who lived, fought, and endured alive through history's quietest voices.